Hello and welcome to another video, making the top grades really easy. Coming up in the video you will see and understand the mark scheme for the Unseen Poet. You will read an essay that got 100% in the 2019 exams from a viewer, Sanjay Saktivel. You will understand what the examiner is looking for, that's what these comments in the margin are about. And you will learn my method, which I call the FOSSE way, which forces you to get the top grades. It absolutely stops you getting anything less than a grade 7, and anyone can do it. So let's start here. Now the key thing is that you need to write about the form of the poem. Now this is more difficult in an unseen poem because you might not know what the form is, and therefore you can substitute structure for form. You'll see what I mean when we look at Sanjay's answer. But this is absolutely crucial. When you start writing about form or structure at the beginning of your essay, the examiner wants to put you in the top band. Let's look at the beginning to show you what I mean. And by the way, it helps not to know the poem, because this will force you to think about what's Sanjay doing, how is he applying the FOSSE way. In The Richest Poor Man in the Valley, McCrae presents the idea that we should live a solemn and unmaterialistic life in order to be happy. Now the examiner's given that a big tick because Sanjay has started off with the writer's point of view. And as you know, I always encourage you to write a thesis statement. So I should make clear in the FOSSE way, every time you write about anything in the poem, you always come back to the writer's point of view. Right, now Sanjay goes straight into a structural feature. The writer uses contrasting lexical fields to show how having material wealth and moral wealth are very different. So we have weather, some, mountain, clouds, gives connotations of a bucolic and pastoral life. Now you don't have to understand this language that Sanjay is using. These are ways of describing the natural world, which was equivalent to 1,000 diamonds. And this is the lexical field, as he calls it, which basically means the language choice of wealth. Now, this is a contrast. And contrast is always structure. It's always a method. So if we jump to the top of the mark scheme, you'll see that you need to write about methods and analyse them. And you also have to have an interpretations. Now notice how Sanjay did that by saying what the writer's purpose was. And that also leads to this idea that he's writing a conceptualised approach. In other words, he's got an argument that he's putting forwards. Now, if we come down to level 4, and this is where grade 5 and grade 6 live, you only need an explained response. You still need methods, but your response only has to be explained. It doesn't have to form an argument, a point of view that you're trying to prove. So as soon as you start relating things to the writer's point of view, then you're automatically bumped up to the top of the mark scheme. That's what I mean by this not being a very difficult thing to do. This suggests how the man didn't need money, house, bank accounts to have a happy life. The contrast, there's the method again, may imply how we should live to fulfill our own dream. There's the conceptualized response. There's the idea of the author's point of view, the poet's point of view. And goods rather than being controlled by wealth. Now I've seen this in nearly every essay I've had back from an examiner. The examiner starts low. By low I mean this isn't level 6, it's level 5. And this always happens because the examiner can see if you're dealing with structure and if you're dealing with the author's point of view, you must be thoughtful, you must be developed. And so they can understand that. They're not yet sure whether you're going to be convincing, and therefore they need to read on. But let's look at this in a positive way. What Sanjay has done when he uses the FOSSE way is he's forced the examiner to say, look, you must put me at least here. You can't come down here and say I've only got clear understanding, because I'm writing about the author's point of view and I'm also writing about the structure of the poem. That's an advanced skill. Only thoughtful students will write about the structure of the poem. So again, it's really easy to control the examiner's thinking right at the beginning of your essay. Now you can see what happens next. The examiner says, oh, there's a level 5 AO2 method bit here. We've already had AO1. And then the very next point becomes level 6 because there's now enough to be convincing. Let's see what Sanjay wrote. The writer uses free verse and enjambment to portray how living a natural life is limited and doesn't have any regulations or prohibitions. So he's linking an aspect of the structure, which is the free verse, and then another aspect of the structure, the enjambment, to the purpose of the poet, to show that life doesn't have any prohibitions, but we put our own limits on it. In the third stanza, there is a caesura which slows down the pace of the lines. This could be synonymous to how a city life can be restrictive and will reduce the speed at which one achieves their goals in life. Now I'm laughing because I think this is utter rubbish. I don't believe this for a minute. However, that doesn't matter. The examiner says, yeah, that's a developed point because you have used a structural feature, here it's the caesura, and you've linked it to the author's purpose to show the reduced speed at which we can achieve our goals when living in a city. Now, you should have noticed by now that there are words like caesura, like enjambment, like free verse, which will crop up every time you meet an unseen poem. So if you learn these definitions and you learn the kind of explanation that Sanjay gives here, you are guaranteed to be able to use 2 out of 3 of them in your exam. You can actually prep this in advance, memorize the sort of sentences you want to write, and as long as you link it to the purpose of the particular poem in the exam, you will get the top marks. Even though the examiner might be chuckling away to themselves like I am and think, actually I don't believe this for a minute. Let's look at the next structural feature. This contrast would present how McCrae believes a more rural life will allow one to develop spiritually and gain happiness, as there wouldn't need to worry about bank accounts. And look, as soon as Sanjay's linked it to a quotation, the examiner has stopped laughing to themselves and said, okay, now you're quoting, I believe you, I'm putting you up to level 6, you are now conceptualized. And so you really need to quote. So where are we in the FOSSE way? Well, he's started writing about structure. Now he's written about form, which is the free verse. That's the form of the poem. So he's nailed form, he's nailed structure. He's also written about the opening of the poem. And he's starting to now think about the language features. Now, language features, you might have learnt it in any number of acronyms. I've just been to a school where they learned it as some kind of bizarre mouse. Schools I know also use SOAPAIMS. These are just acronyms that help you remember these sorts of language features. Here we have simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, personification, adjectives, imagery, and senses. No idea why I didn't make that red as well. So you can clearly see that's where these letters come from, the first letters of each of the language features. And this is just a small selection. You could have any number of language features. It's just a reminder that you must comment on them. Why do you have to name the features? Well, because that's what methods means. So methods is right there in level 6. It's also there in level 5. And even when we come down, we'll see it's still in level 4. It's only when you start coming down to grades 1 and 2 where you don't have to write about methods, with the right subject terminology. Of course, what that means is if you're not using subject terminology correctly, it's very difficult to get out of level 2. In other words, you're going to be stuck at grades 2 and 3. You desperately need subject terminology, some of which has to be relevant, so some of it has to be right. So an easy way to move up the mark scheme is learn what these methods are and use the names correctly. Now, if we do that, I can guarantee 2 of these will come up every single time. Simile in every single poem, alliteration in every single poem. If you're not sure what the method is, is it personification, is it metaphor? I've left metaphor out of my list. What are you doing, Mr. Salles? Have you gone to sleep? Oh my God, you might be saying to yourself, I don't know if it's a metaphor or personification, what am I going to do? Well, you're going to cheat. You're going to say the poet's imagery, because all of these will be imagery. So if in doubt, always use that word, and you will always be meeting the examiner's criteria to talk about methods. The next method that Sanjay focuses on is juxtaposition, which of course is just another word for contrast. In this poem, the juxtaposition is between richest and poor. And it doesn't matter what the poem is, I promise you, you will find juxtaposition and contrast in there. So I always train my students to look for that in their language text as well, in the language exam. Contrast and juxtaposition is always present. Now we come down to the examiner's bit of excitement. What is it that Sanjay has done that's made the examiner say, yes, that's level 6? Well, here it is. Therefore, McCrae could be suggesting how society should relieve themselves from urban life and venture into the natural world. Now, it's not his brilliant vocabulary that's getting him that grade, although the vocabulary is brilliant. It's his focus on the poet's purpose. McCrae could be suggesting how. That is the poet's purpose. So it's no longer just an explained response showing clear understanding. It is now conceptualized because he keeps writing about the poet's purpose in every paragraph. And that means he's building a convincing argument together, or if you prefer, a convincing analysis. In other words, Sanjay has got a point of view about what the poet is up to. And having that point of view about what the poet is up to forces the examiner to put him in the top marks. How do you remind yourself to do that in the exam? You do what Sanjay does. Every time you make a point, you then finish the paragraph by saying, and the poet is doing this because. And every time you say the poet is doing this because, you get the marks. Now Sanjay also has another trick about showing that he's exploring. So instead of saying actually the poet is doing this because, Sanjay says he might be doing this because. So Sanjay uses the word could. That tells the examiner that he's exploring possibilities. Hey examiner, I am being exploratory. And the examiner goes, ooh, yes, exploratory, using could and maybe and perhaps. I think I'll put that in the top level. And it's so easy to control the examiner's mind by using the right words. Another word that Sanjay uses is the word society. So if you think of any writer of any text having a purpose, that purpose is always to influence society. Writers are always trying to change the society of their day. Therefore, every time you use the word society in your answer, you're always writing about the poet's purpose, which means you're always being conceptualized. Now, that again forces the examiner to put you in the top band. I hope you can see how easy this can be. Now, because Sanjay is writing this in an exam with no preparation, he's got halfway through his essay and he's thought, whoops, I have not yet written about form, even though we saw that he had when he talked about free verse. But because he's brilliant at taking the exam, he's got the FOSSE way in his mind, or his version of it, he's therefore said, right, I've got to go back to write about the form because I know that's what's going to put me in the top mark band. So he gives us another paragraph about form, and the examiner goes, oh, that's got to be level 6. He links it to a quotation, of course, and therefore the examiner has to give him the marks. Now, to make sure he's dealt with the whole of the poem, he takes his quotation from the end of it, and then he gives us a conclusion. The advantage of writing a conclusion is that, again, it shows you're being conceptualized. It comes back to McCrae's purpose. He's forgotten the name of McCrae, so he's used the writer, which is absolutely spot on. He's telling the examiner, look, I am thinking about the writer's purpose, therefore I must be conceptualized, therefore please put me in level 6. And the examiner says, oh, okay. And the other thing that I love about Sanjay's conclusion is that he does what I tell all my students to do, always include quotation in your conclusion. Sanjay's actually included 2. So the writer believes that living life with the sun would allow one to enrich their soul and gain happiness, as they would build better lives that aren't steered by money. So that full description of the writer's point of view again comes back to this idea of having a concept that you're explaining throughout, and it also helps the examiner think, yes, there's a proper conclusion here. I find that convincing rather than just thoughtful. Now imagine Sanjay hadn't written as well, but he just followed through the FOSSE way. Well, he'd never fall below a level 5 because it would always be thoughtful and developed. How do I know that? Well, writing about the form and the structure is always going to be thoughtful, and it's something that most students won't do. So maybe I should improve my teaching and actually find a way to explain all these things better. I'll do that in a later video. In fact, if you can make a list of the structural features and turn them into a mnemonic like the FOSSE way, any old mnemonic at all, which you think is memorable, like SOAPAIMS or the something or other mouse, I'll send you a copy of one of my guides. There's the language exam, the Jekyll and Hyde, how to write awesome stories, Inspector Calls, the literature guide. Oh, how exciting! I didn't know I got a bestseller rank. Thank you. The guide to Macbeth, or how to write awesome description, or if you just want to be a better teacher, the Slightly Awesome Teacher, I could send you a copy of that. So email me at sallesdominic@gmail.com, and likewise, if you've got an essay that you'd like me to publish in a book or an essay that you would like me to make a video on, why not email it to me there? I can't promise that I will do any of those things, but if it's brilliant, I will. And now to the ending of FOSSE way. It says right about the ending of the poem because that is always where the author will explain their final point of view. We saw that in Sanjay's conclusion, linking the ending to the poet's point of view, and that's why he got full marks. So if you would like to understand some videos which really explain this awesome technique in more detail, check them out. There'll be videos popping up here and all over the place to make your life better and to turn you into a top grade student without too much effort. What's not to like? See you soon on my channel.